Welcome everyone to the Remarque Institute. Thank you for coming right before the beginning of our spring break. In the last moments before everybody takes off. My name is Stefanos Geroulanos. I'm the director of the Institute, and it's my delight to get to introduce Sophia Rosenfeld today for our event on her book, The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom and Modern Life, which you can also purchase right outside. Sophie is the Walter Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is currently also the History Department Chair, thereby proving the impossible that you can publish a major book and chair something at this completely insane time that we're living in. So Sophie has published 3 more books. In her first book, A Revolution in Language, she studied signs and language in late 18th century France and showed us a way of how to do this and how to think both of cultural and political changes and the revolutions on the basis of a linguistic study. Her 2 later books sort of speak for themselves from the title: Common Sense: A Political History, which came out in 2011, and which won the Mark Linton History Prize and the Society for the History of the Early American Republic Book Prize, and more recently, Democracy and Truth: A Short History, which was published in 2019. She has many other distinctions, which you can find on her website. And of those and of her service to the profession, I wanted to mention that she was vice president of the American Historical Association, where she was in charge of the research agenda. And she has been named by the French government an officier dans l'ordre de Palme académique, which just sounds incredibly cool. I was told last week that my introductions are getting a little bit too long, partly because I don't really like to do a website style intro. And while I'm a bit resentful of that comment, I haven't decided if it's right, and I will basically abide and be briefer than usual. I do want to mention 2 things. One is something that I've always admired about Sophie's work, and that is expressed in the new book as well. Namely, that she has been one of the pioneers in what is sometimes referred to as historical epistemology, the study of the historical conditions of possibility for the emergence of something or for the making certain particular claims. How do these claims become possible? Her books on language and on common sense are essential to this. They aren't simply classic intellectual histories. They offer, in a sense, a deeper study of how it was possible for scholars and intellectuals and other people to think as they did, to make claims as they did. This is particularly meaningful to me because there's only a small number of people who identify as doing historical epistemology, and I include myself in that category. But if it's niche on the one hand, it's also worth noting that Sophie's also really good at covering her tracks on this in her writing. And in particular, that you can read this book without having any idea, and you can read her earlier work without having any idea of what the sort of niche engagements in historical epistemology would be. So I really love this ability to talk at both levels, both one that is specific to let's say a small subgroup that emerged out of history of science, and one that's much more public and usually and beautifully clear. She does this in the current book as well, at a bigger scale and with a ton more detail, and always with an eye to the present time. She writes in the introduction that this book is about how a very particular transformation, how it established first liberal and then sometimes neoliberal freedom, how freedom came about from its initial stirrings, quote, in early modern commercial and religious contexts across the North Atlantic world, to its mid to late 20th century quasi-global turn. This is the previously untold story, I'm still quoting, of an idea and a way of life that have been fundamental to defining the modern world. Together with Sophie, we are going to have 2 commentators. First, we'll go Nicolas Guilhot, who is a professor of intellectual history at the European University Institute in Florence, and a joint fellow this semester between the Moynihan Center at City College and Remarque Institute. He has just completed a book on conspiracy, a brief history of political paranoia, which is forthcoming from Harvard. And his last book was called After the Enlightenment, Political Realism and International Relations in the mid-20th century, which came out in 2017. And also Jennifer Szalai, who is a literary critic and a nonfiction critic at the New York Times, where she has been since 2018. She was previously an editor at the New York Times Book Review, and before that, a senior editor at Harper's. She has also written for The Economist, the London Review of Books, and many other publications. Thanks are meanwhile due to Amy Nguyen and Sam Paul, who work with me at Remarque, but I think at this point we can just move on to Sophie, who will speak first, then Nicolas and then Jennifer. So welcome, Sophie.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. When I found out it was the beginning of spring break, I'm overwhelmed that anybody has bestirred themselves the day before spring break, because spring break always starts at least a day or two before spring break. So that's something.
My class was empty yesterday.
There you go. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, everybody at Remarque. And thank you so much to both of you for the very kind gesture of agreeing to not just comment, but have to read the thing first. So that's, so I don't want to talk for too long because I'd much rather have a conversation with others, but I'll give you a sort of short, I think this is the prescription, give a sort of short overview of what this is about. So I'm going to start with a kind of banality, and that is that most of us are pretty used to and good at picking things off menus of options. Steph and I just had a coffee. We went to a coffee shop on Fifth Avenue. There are options. It's not really so hard to figure out, do I want the latte or the chai? Do I want a small or large? We do this all day long in all sorts of ways. This is a pretty obvious observation. We pick, you pick off library catalogs, you pick things off Amazon, we pick things off ballots. This is part of what it means to live in the modern world, at least in our part of the modern world. And we don't usually, I think, question either the truism that something about doing all this is what it feels like today to be free. How does freedom go with choice? Well, you pick what you want, and the idea is when you get what you want, you're in a sense getting to define your own existence. Moreover, by being the kind of person who's given the possibility of choice, you get to be an autonomous adult figure. This is kind of what gives us standing in the world too, to be a chooser. This too is a kind of truism. What I think is particularly interesting about it is it runs across the right-left spectrum. Say in American political life, you might disagree about what can be chosen, but the idea that more opportunities for choice, more options is good, tends to be a kind of given. And what particularly I think is striking is that it not only is an object central to consumer culture, that much is obvious, billboards always say make the smart choice, the right choice, the good choice, but it's central to democracy and it's central to human rights culture. Human rights since 1948 have been largely framed as the possibility of being able to choose where you live, what profession you do, who you marry, what religion you practice, and a whole range of other things. So why write a book about this if it's also obvious? Good question, even though I just posed it. The reason I think is because I'm interested as a historian less in the categories of things that we're always fighting over that are kind of explicit subjects of confrontation than I am in the, back to this idea of this epistemology, but I'll put it differently. I would describe myself as kind of historian of the taken for granted. In other words, I'm interested in the kinds of things that we don't think about much and we don't talk about much because they seem rather obvious. I'm always interested in how did that come to be? How did it come to be that, for instance, we define freedom as almost synonymous with freedom of choice? So as a historian, I was struck by two things about this. I thought, well, choice will be an interesting thing to explore because it really does make capitalism and democracy sit so well together. And we see elements of it all over the world at this point. But if you study the past anywhere in the world, you would discover pretty quickly that not only did people in the past and in many other parts of the world have fewer options and fewer opportunities for choice, they didn't give it the same valence. It doesn't have the same significance. Even in a Western European context, if you're a nobleman in 17th or 18th century France, part of what makes you free is you don't have to make a lot of choices. You've got a name, you've got a guaranteed income, you have land, you have possessions, you probably, your marriage will be arranged to someone. You don't, it's not a sense that freedom is the independence of having that kind of stature. It's not I get to pick what I want to do for a job. I get to pick how I want to dress. That's a very modern idea, and it's culturally specific. So I thought there might be a story here that's interesting, one that's sort of hiding in plain sight because it's not something we've talked much about. The second reason for writing the book, though, was maybe a little more personal, but also something that comes out of things like behavioral economists and philosophers who've had a lot more to say about choice than historians. Historians deal with the choices people have made, but they don't make choice a category generally. But if you read, say, behavioral economists or philosophers, there's a whole literature out there about how bad we are at making choices, how we don't know our own minds, that we think we want this on Monday, and on Wednesday we want something different, and we're open to persuasion of different sorts. There's a lot more along that. And we've all felt, and I think I've felt this too, if this is supposed to be freedom, how come sometimes making a choice is so difficult and sometimes even excruciating? Everybody's felt sort of, even in the most banal example, you go to Amazon, you want to buy, I don't know, a vacuum cleaner, a pair of socks, and alas, 6,000 options show up. No one wants that, right? It's not freeing. It's like, maybe I don't need new socks, turn it off. So I thought, could I not only write a history of how choice came to be modern freedom, but could I start to think about the ways it's been liberating, which it certainly has in a variety of ways, from emancipation movements to feminism, but also the ways that it's limited our horizons for personal freedom and even more our collective freedom, the limits of thinking always about choice as what we do when we want to be free. So it took me a long time to figure out how to do this because, okay, so there's the risk is you write the history of everything under the sun. And it already took me a long time. That would have taken an extra decade or so. So I finally came up with some sort of ground rules, which I will tell you what they are very briefly. And then I'll tell you what sort of the conclusions are. And then I will listen to more interesting commentary on this. 5 or so things that I decided would be helpful in writing this book. One was not to write a history of great thinkers talking about freedom or choice, to instead imagine that anything that became this ordinary and this natural to us had to have not just come from reading Kant or even reading John Stuart Mill. It had to have come out of a kind of experiential basis. So I decided to concentrate on the social practices and see if I could kind of do an intellectual history out of social practices that were related to choosing. So I moved through shopping, an important neologism of the late 18th century, the experience of going into a fixed store and where there's displayed goods and picking, do I like the stripes or the checks or the blue or the red? What is this, this idea of learning to, in a sense, be a modern person who has preferences that are internal, that get externalized through this choice-making activity. Shopping is one key place. It's not purely an economic story. The other is the fallout in the post-Reformation world of the expansion of possibilities in terms of both religious and intellectual choice. Not saying that they're exactly the same, but I think both are important precursors. And I look at social practices around everything from going to the library to creating commonplace books where you note down the things you've chosen from among the plethora of possibilities that exist. Romantic choice, sexual choice. I look at balls in the 19th century in particular, where there's an entire etiquette around how do you select someone to dance with, especially if you're doing something kind of daring, like waltzing in a kind of intimate way with a stranger in many cases. I look at political choice, the evolution in voting, and I look finally at the sciences of choice that emerge in the 20th century, from economics to psychology, psychiatry, all about how and why we choose the way we do, but also about how to improve choice making. So the first thing, social practices. The second, very simply, is not to think of this solely as the disappearance of rules that kept people from making choices, but actually the creation of ever more rules around choice making. That law, in some ways, both informal law and formal laws, proliferated precisely to help us make these choices. They produce exclusions, but they also make doing these things possible. We all know what the rules are when you have a sandwich buffet out there. You know, you don't take all of them and put them in your bag and take them home or something like that. There's an etiquette for everything we do that involves selection. And I think that's sometimes formal if you're voting, informal, if say you're in the world of courtship. I would tell the story in a third one is I would tell the story in a nonlinear way that I could, you know, give myself the indulgence to hop around places and times because the story isn't one smooth continuum. The fourth is that I would spend a lot of time looking at women. That part came later. I didn't start out thinking that, but looking at those people who in some ways were the original modern choosers, shoppers, for instance, but also the ways women have always been constrained by the assumption that preference-based choosing is kind of lightweight. It's something sort of silly, flibberty-gibberty people do, has tainted women, and the way women have made choice a horizon, an aspiration, up until, you know, I go as far as the debates around Roe v. Wade in the 1970s, thinking about this. I also use a lot of novels to tell the story because while I also look at things like ballots and menus, it's in novels that you can find, especially around women, the psychology of choice making, from learning to do it, to navigating it, to being constrained by it, and both liberated and harmed. I think Jane Austen is, you know, a really good thing to read if you're interested in choice and women. And finally, I would come to some normative conclusions, even though historians aren't really supposed to do that, but that I thought it was okay to kind of break the rules a little bit. And there's a historical argument here about how late in the game this modern form of choosing emerges, about how that not to think of the age of democratic revolutions in the 18th century as much as a kind of a late 19th into 20th century moment as the moment when these pieces start to come together, where our political world starts to match our economic and consumer world, and how this happens in the course of the 19th into 20th century out of these kind of 17th century beginnings. There's a kind of reperiodization that happens, but there's also an argument finally about the kinds of gains and losses and here's where actually the debate around abortion is very helpful, I think, for thinking about this, the ways in which fixing on choice opened up new possibilities, but it never really worked as a way to kind of create a sort of larger scale form of liberation. So the final part of this is really about the losses and the gains as we switched from a form of choice that I would call Hercules's choice at the very beginning of the book, which is this older trope of the figure's always kind of torqued like this because Hercules is in the middle between virtue and vice, two women, and kind of likes vice. Vice looks pretty appealing, not surprisingly, what's not to like, but in the end turns to virtue. And choice is a moralized process. To this second moment, the kinds of choice that I look at, starting with the shopping, have less of this. They're more about preference. They're not about doing the right thing or the wrong thing. They're doing what your interior self tells you to do. There isn't a right or wrong spouse, say there's the person that you prefer. Now, that's not to say morality goes away in all of this, but the freeing of the idea that there's always a horizon of the right and the wrong is the sort of middle piece. And the last piece is really the valorization of choice itself, to the degree that we've made choice itself the moral good, just having it, often without thinking about what we might be choosing. And I could say more later if anybody wants to about what that means in this very particular moment. Recent executive orders have offered us freedom of choice in light bulbs and in, I think, washing machines and cars. We can think about what that might mean in the context of all of this. I will not say anything more now, but I'll just leave it for that's kind of the big story. And I will be more than eager to hear responses. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Sophie. I must say, it's been a pleasure to read the book, and it's been also My experience as a reader has been that of a surprise, because when it first arrived and I opened the package at home, and The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life, and I thought, "Oh, not yet another intellectual history of a big idea," because we have so many of those, right? Histories of freedom, history of liberty, and you can add, sovereignty, republicanism. So, and on the face of it, it is a standard history, right? It is a history of choice, or the exercise of freedom as choice. It's in the Atlantic world. You navigate between essentially the United Kingdom and the North America. It has its roots in the Protestant Reformation, when you write about religious freedom. Its fortunes are closely tied to the emergence of that figure of the bourgeois, with its right to privacy and so on and so forth, freed from the burden of tradition. And at the same time, it takes you by surprise, because it's not a traditional history of ideas. I mean, Stuart Mill is mentioned, Karl Marx makes a cameo, but it's essentially it's a remarkable and very innovative effort to think about how it feels to be free, and how it feels to be free is to exercise that as freedom. And so you focus on, you said it in your presentation, on social practices. It's really not the history of an idea, but the history of actually all the supporting props that make the idea possible in the first place.
Yeah.
And so there's a wonderful range of, it's a book about situations, about technologies, about objects, about existential situations, moral dilemmas. I love the fact that you bring in quite systematically literature. It's wonderful. And even literature itself is not just a document about situations of choice. You mentioned some of the characters of some classic novels, but even certain kinds of literature, anthologies, are already the exercise of choice, more bourgeoisie, and so on and so forth. So there's a wonderful range of very different situations that you actually bring together in a very coherent landscape, where you can really see the material, practical expansion of the range of choice in modern life. Now, and the more I read, the more I was really caught into this. And it really, the title is somehow misleading, because it's a book that is, and in a nice way, it takes you by surprise, really. And two things struck me, really, and I want to go to the gist of my argument here. The first thing, which I found extremely interesting, is, okay, what happens when you leave behind the classical formula for the history of ideas? You won't find the analysis of texts and treatises in the classics. That's not what the book is about. And instead, you go for a history of methods, technologies, strategies, habits, opinions. So one thing that happens is that the idea of choice, or of freedom as choice, loses some of its grandiosity. It stops to be highfalutin. It's something very concrete, sometimes very prosaic. The chapter on, there's a wonderful chapter about dance cards, finding your life partner. It's absolutely remarkable, and also very entertaining sometimes. So the idea of choice loses some of its grandiosity, and what you see is a much more complex picture, in which when there is choice, there's also a very dense social environment that shapes choice. You have manipulation, you have constraints, you have control of the outcomes of choice, or structuration of the range of possible preferences, and so on and so forth. Advice, education, moral chaperoning, and so on and so forth, that secures or the range of possible choices, or if not, some outcomes. So what that suggests, or what you suggest, I think, is that choice is always constrained choice. That's when choice is real, is when it's constrained. And so that enabling choice is the same thing as constraining it. I mean, that might be, I'm sort of teasing out something that is, to me, was a sort of undercurrent of your book.
Just very nicely said, that's all.
And so I found that very interesting, which leads me to my second point. It's because enabling choice is also inevitably constraining choice. And it's interesting that you said that this came late in the writing of the book, but it's the reason why women are so central in your story. And I think that's one of the most interesting and important part of the book. They are the center of the first chapter on shopping. Well, okay. They are the center of the second chapter on dance cards. They're crucial to the epilogue, and I'll come back to the epilogue, which is about abortion. But they pop up regularly in between. They become a constant, central character of the story. And so for one, it's because it's probably arguably for women that the range of choices has expanded most dramatically in the last 2 centuries, also because we start from a very low position, subaltern position. But by virtue of their choice or their range of choice being expanded, the range of technologies by which their choice were controlled also expanded accordingly. Because of the threat that their agency represented. So what if a woman starts to vote the same way she chooses between Calicot and poplin, between a piece of cloth, which is essentially what your first chapter is about? That becomes problematic. What if they exercise the same degree of irrationality in their political choices as they did in their shopping practices? So there's something inherently threatening in the expansion of the range of choice offered to women. Not to mention what happens if they by controlling the capacity to give birth, they essentially have an impact on moral standards. So that they are absolutely key to that to the story you tell. So it's the increase of choice for women, but also of the fears and threatening nature of those choices for the rest of society. And so if that's the case, then the consequence is that the more choice women have, well, the more you have to have men in charge. That's the consequence. And I think you show that quite well as well. If you step back, look at who creates the catalogs, who develops the opportunities and the technologies for choice, it's often men. So I wonder whether the case of women is not exemplary in as much as it makes visible that the problem of choice, and more generally, that it makes visible the problems of choice, but also more generally, the backstage props that liberalism has used to control choices at every level, whenever it became democratized, and perhaps also the growing suspicion that you can't trust not just women, but people in general to make the right choices. And here I'd like to move to a second part of your book, which is about the sciences, the social sciences of choice that develop after 45. Because if we adopt the view that choice expands, but at the same time, the threats represented by expansive choice also develop accordingly, we have a slightly different view of this history of freedom, of liberal freedoms, right? We have a scenario in which it's not just the expansion of the areas of social life offered to choice and self-fashioning that matter, but the simultaneous effort to control those areas increasingly in a capillary fashion. And the question becomes that who controls them and how they're controlled? How do you control the outcomes of choice? And you dedicate, I think, very interesting developments to the development, to the social sciences of choice after 45. I'd like to focus a little bit on rational choice. I think it's relevant. It's very relevant. I'm not sure it's just a later chapter in the history of Homo economicus that starts with the marginalist revolution in the 19th century. It's true, but another part of the rational choice theories that pop up after 45 is that they operate with a very thin notion of rationality. Very, very thin. It's not substantial. It's not reason.
Right.
It's something that actually doesn't exist before 45. Rationality is really developed then as a concept. It means basically transitivity of the preferences. It's a fancy word for something very basic, that if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you prefer A to C. And it assumes also that preferences are set axiomatically. And the problem with that is, of course, and you mentioned that people may look at a shopping exercise the way they look at an electoral choice. Paul Lazarsfeld famously claimed that people choose their candidates the way they chose a bar of soap. However, for most rational choice theorists, it was very clear that politics and the rest of choice were fundamentally different. Because in politics, not just you buy a product, there's a collective dimension. And to have rationality, you have to have coercion, because you have to set some preferences out. That's the Auer theorem. You cannot have more than 2 people. If you have more than 2 people in a room, nothing guarantees that the result of their choices will be rational. And that was clear to Arrow, to Tullock, Buchanan, and so on and so forth. And so in this scenario as well, the more choice we have, the more this choice has to be coerced somehow. And the more choice we have, the more we choose like women, in a way, in your story, which is why they're so central in the gender perspective. I think it must be central to that history of freedom as choice. The second consequence, and I'm moving to an end of my comment, perhaps of the development of the science of choice after 45, is that rationality is a property of the choice itself, not of the chooser, increasingly so. The chooser in rational choice theory is somebody who has poor information, who doesn't read the social environment, who is unsure about the intention of others, and essentially is a person fumbling in the dark. Can you really trust him or her? Well, no. So that means that ideally, if you want to secure the rationality of these choices, you have to separate this choice making and the chooser, the decision and the decision maker. And these were the heydays of simulations, cybernetics, games, and so on and so forth. So choice was moved away from actual people choosing to the confined atmospheres of laboratories, game setups. It was moved away from the concrete situation of choice. I just have a quote from Sidney Verba, who's one of these social choice theories. The greater the involvement of an individual in a situation, the greater will be the effect of non-logical and predispositional influences. So if a choice is real, it's not rational. Essentially, that's what he was saying. So the rational decision maker, the rational chooser must be unattached, unconditioned, right? Its preference must be set in advance and sovereign. And that in a way is a sort of almost a replication of old arguments about property owning people being able to vote. It's the same thing that is being reprocessed through this social science of choice after 45. So you have, in order to have rational choice, you have to have unconditioned choice. You have to have set theory. You have to have people who have no attachment, people who are sovereign, people who are unconditioned. You have to have men in charge, essentially, again. And these men don't make choices, they decide. And I wanted to ask you about the differences. That's a concept that doesn't come in your book. Between choice and decision. A decision from Schmidt onward is different. I'm not choosing between alternatives that are presented to me. I decide what the alternatives are. I create a new reality. And it's a new world. It's different. And so the question becomes, is choice something that is that important at the end of the day? Because you could also argue that at the end of this history you're telling, we end up in a world where we never had that much choice, but the choice is often inconsequential, and we have very little decision-making power. Right? So I'd like you to react to that maybe more. And it seems to me, as I was reading the book, that there was this suspicion throughout that maybe choice is not exactly the right concept, because it's always constrained. There's always something in the background. And that comes out very forcefully in the epilogue. And I was wondering whether in retrospect, you thought that choice was that fundamental to modern freedom or not. And whether you can maybe take a stance on these questions. But thank you very much, because this was a wonderfully stimulating book.
Thank you for those wonderful comments. That's taking furious notes.
First, do you want to address them a little bit?
I'll just, I mean, there's a lot to respond to there, but I'll give it just a few minutes. The decision versus choice. I did make the decision to focus on choice, which choice being selecting from a menu of options supplied by someone else, as opposed to decisions, which are simply part of how humans' brains operate. Choice is something more specific, I think. And is it all inconsequential in the end? An interesting question. I think it's not really that important that what social scientists ultimately decided about the way we make choices, because we all live as if we are independent agents making choices all the time. In other words, there is a whole debate about, do we have free will at all? Biologists have lots to say about this, and all of that's very important. But the truth is, we go through most of our life thinking of ourselves as autonomous agents doing this thing and making rational choices, even when they are, from many perspectives, irrational. So it's, what really interests me is, how did we come to think of ourselves as choosers in this sense? And you mentioned finally, which I didn't say, and I'm glad you brought this up, the importance in this book, not just of the choosers, but of the people that I really borrow the term from behavioral economists, choice architects, choice agents. They're the people who script things for us. They could be advertisers, they could, or shopkeepers, but they could also be party officials who determine who you're voting for. They could be algorithms today that, steer you. If you like this book, you might like this one, that kind of thing. They're kind of giving us rules. Dancing masters are one of the choice agents in this. And they can be government officials, they can be private sector officials. I like your idea that they're often men. And I'll just give one example. A very important part of the book is about the rise of the secret ballot. And the secret ballot is not really a universal standard till quite late, at least 100 years after the age of revolutions. People are still voting out loud in Kentucky in the 1890s. In France, they don't get those little booths that, the isoloirs till just before the First World War. Now, of course, we can't imagine anyone voting. It would defy human rights standards for people to vote publicly, because we feel that actually it's important for each person to be isolated to make their rational choice in a little booth. So we go out in public, and then we do this weird thing of going behind a little curtain, pulling a lever, pulling the curtain back open, exiting again, getting a sticker that says I voted. It's kind of a civic duty, but it's performed in a weird way. And I think that's, you could say, well, this is really scripted. This is all about choice agents, but it's also part of telling us, even if it were irrational in the end, that we've done this thing that is about actualizing our internal preferences, which will simply be aggregated later, rather than an earlier notion of voting where we might say, like, let's have a conversation in this room and think about what we want to share here. Would one be better than the other? It's not a debate we have very much anymore, but I think since we operate in so many different ways as if we are rational choosers, and the social science for a long time backed up that idea, and we participated in making it by filling out surveys and all sorts of things, that it's become our norm, even if there are plenty of social scientists who would tell us that what we're really doing is pretty irrational in the end. So that's my response to a terrific set of comments. Thank you very much.
Hi, so thank you so much, Stephanos, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And Sophia, I wanted to echo what Nicolas said about how pleasurable this book is, which I feel is really, interesting and rare for a subject as serious as this one, which, as Nicola mentioned, ends with the subject of reproductive rights. And Nicola, you got at a question, I think, toward the end of your presentation that I was also curious about too, which is this notion of, I can understand the problem of conflating choice with freedom. But at the same time, I think in your book toward the end, especially, you get to this notion of the people who are actually denied freedom, understandably, or who are denied choice, I should say, understandably place an extraordinary amount of importance on having choice. And so I guess this question that I have, which is any notion of freedom contingent on having at least some choice? I mean, is choice necessary but insufficient, or is it totally unnecessary? So that was my first question.
Terrific.
I thought maybe you wanted to,
that's a wonderful and important question. And I love the idea, is choice necessary but insufficient? So coercion, which is having no choice, or being given choices that are terrible ones, which is another possibility. Two choices, you have to, choices that are impossible, are a form of sort of severe constraint that remind us how important it is not to think of choice as something like, we could live without it. We certainly want choice in many areas of our lives. And I hope it becomes clear that I really do think a lot of liberation comes from having choice in a lot of arenas. That said, there are places in which choice might not provide that freedom. Just to give a small example, would you rather have 9 different healthcare plans on the table in front of you with all different contingencies and different, different things will happen depending on something you can't predict, which is what your health will be in the future? Or would you rather have, say, one plan that was supplied centrally in some case? Would we be willing to give up choice in healthcare plans? I think most people would for a good plan. They wouldn't need to say, like, I want 20% off this price for whatever. That's a pretty banal example. But what I mean to say is that choice is fundamental to our lives. To argue anything different would be to really also belittle the people in the world who are denied all kinds of choice, whether they're people imprisoned or people in circumstances where they are denied not just all of our choices, but most of our choices. That said, I don't think choice is the answer to everything. So there must be places in which it's not just insufficient, it's not even necessary, perhaps. And I'm not sure what those are, but it's something one could just think about and discuss at a personal level or as a kind of social commitment. So I don't know if that gets
Yeah,
at
no,
what
that
you're-
definitely gets at it. And, actually, this was something that I was also thinking as I was reading this question of in which domains do we have a real choice?
Mhm.
And, thinking about somebody like Trump, who, when he was campaigning last year, told an audience of conservative Christians, if you vote for me, you'll never have to
Right.
vote again. And that
Yeah.
was not a threat. That was the sales pitch.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I think, as you pointed out, he's also telling people that they can choose to use incandescent light bulbs, that's a choice that he presents as something that was stymied or thwarted
Mhm.
by the previous dispensation. So I'm just wondering how you think about those things in terms of our current moment.
I wrote the book before I knew what
Right.
the election results were going to be. And so I've been, and I've been trying to sort of wrap my mind around this question of, am I writing about something that's basically disappearing, a kind of liberal order of some kind, which is one possibility. Another possibility, though, is that we're seeing a kind of morphing of this idea where a more authoritarian state gets combined with a kind of increasingly libertarian ethos in the economic sphere. And that's an unfamiliar pattern. It's not sort of classic fascism or something like that. It's some kind of new hybrid. It might look more like something like China in some ways, right? Where choice in terms of electoral choice is diminished in significance, or it's just symbolic. People go out, as they do in many parts of the world, and participate in an election, but the election's not meaningful in the sense of producing an outcome that's determined by the public. But in other spheres, Trump has gone right to the idea of freedom of choice as a kind of American value, or maybe a global capitalist value at this point, around things like light bulbs. And then you'd sort of have to ask at some point also, it reminds me of the appropriation of my body, my choice for anti-masking, where you say, for instance, I'm just following a traditional line of, it's my body, I can do what I want with it. Well, fine, except that the consequences have an impact on everyone else. If it was your body and it didn't impact anyone else, that might be one thing. But the same way, using, certain kinds of washing machines or cars, driving them is going to impact all of us. Maybe it's not your choice. It's not in our interest for everybody to have the widest range of consumer choice if you don't want global warming to increase. So I think we're moving towards a kind of new form of the choice paradigm without actually moving entirely away from it. But I don't know, I'm curious what you think.
I think, related to this, I was thinking, and you sort of mentioned it, where you talk about other countries where there is sort of a performance of choice in terms of elections that are not quite competitive. And
Yeah.
so, in the context of the United States, I recently read an interesting post by David Bell where he was talking about how, you know, you have a chapter where you talk about the secret ballot, which I
Mhm.
found fascinating because I had always sort of thought about the secret ballot as a given, which
Yeah,
I feel
most of
like
us
it's
do.
right, exactly. And so how there were people, including Mill, who were very critical of the notion of a secret ballot, that a choice that important should be public because it's embedded within the sort of social arena. So of course you should, you know, present what your choice is. But Bell made the interesting argument, and it was just sort of tacked on at the end, and he just floated the idea that if there were a secret ballot in the Senate, that maybe we wouldn't get, you know, Defense Secretary Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, that Republicans are scared of performing their choice before Trump, but privately, of course, you know, they tell, you know, everybody that they're against whatever's going on. So I was wondering
That's, yeah, it's
what
an
you might
interesting
make of
idea.
something like that.
Right, what an interesting idea. I mean, the reason I put so much emphasis on the secret ballot
Yeah.
is that it's odd that it wasn't, from our perspective, it's odd that it wasn't the gold standard immediately after the American Revolution or the French Revolution. And I have to admit that I was quite surprised by when I did learn, everybody else probably already knew this, but that Mill, who was on the side of choice in so many arenas, was horrified that the idea that political choice might become a little more like shopping or something. And he was on the wrong side of this process. And he accepted that one of the risks of communal voting is that people with power end up coercing indirectly those without power. So landlords and bosses would tell other people what to do. Although sometimes the secret ballot was used to disenfranchise, as in the case of Black voters or immigrant voters who could be, you know, kind of kept out of voting by making it complicated enough that they couldn't understand what they were doing or read the language it was in. So it's not like secret voting always goes with one kind of politics. But it's an important turning point, and it's interesting because our voting became increasingly private, secret, individualized. Voting inside electoral bodies became increasingly, to use a F word, transparent, deliberately, because the idea was that they had to be representing our votes. So we needed to know they were executing on behalf of us. What I think we're seeing at the moment is exactly what you're talking about, which is that they actually are more afraid of other forces inside the state than they are of their constituents. And so people who might well want to be voting differently, either out of personal moral qualms, but also to reflect their constituents, feel they can't because they're being coerced almost as if they were electors in an old style voting and the boss was standing there over them. So it's a really interesting question. We'd give up a lot if we didn't know how our elected officials voted. On the other hand, when the state becomes more like a mob boss, there are risks to the kind of voting that has them performing some kind of decision making when the vote's been predetermined. I don't know. That's an interesting
Right.
question. What do we need a new way of voting
And also, I mean,
publicly?
and also I think that it sort of gets at that, you know, for some of these Republicans who secretly maybe say, well, I had no choice,
Right,
right? That
right,
they're
that's
they're scared of Trump, they're scared
Mhm.
of, you know, getting death threats. I mean, there's that sort
Yeah,
of
they are.
aspect to it, that they, you know, the fundamental attribution error, that they're
Mhm.
constrained by circumstance. But, you know, I think when we look at when other people do things, we sort of say, well, they had the freedom of choice
Right.
to do something. And so this is, you know, one of the other things that I was also very interested in this book, and Nicola, you brought this up, which is the role of women
Mhm.
and, you know, how the conversation and the understanding of choice, how it's so connected to women in such a way that it's used to often dismiss choice as merely trivial.
Mhm.
And, you know, what the two of you were just talking about just a few minutes ago about choice architects and how, you know, the men become the ones in charge. But at the same time, I feel like there's sort of this stereotype, and you see it coming up, of women are the ones who will play the sort of stern mother figure or the school mom figure. They're the ones who are not letting you say what you want. I mean, this is the sort of discourse around Trumpism, I feel like, that the people who don't allow you to speak freely are, you know, sort of this feminized coded or feminine coded authority figure. And you know, that's not something you necessarily get into in the book. I feel like it just sort of could go in another direction, but.
No, that's an interesting point, because I, the novel dramatizes this, I think, always, right? The modern novel is in some ways the choice genre par excellence, right? And you have, often there's and this goes back to the 18th century and forward to many novels today. It's not always a woman at the center, but it often is, including in 18th century novels. And on the one hand, she has desires and she has internal wishes that she wants to actualize in some way. But she's constrained in both productive and constraining ways, just as you suggest, by a combination of things. Sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's pressure from family or community, and almost always it's kinds of moral pressures, and that women feel particularly because they are sort of held to certain standards, and they can be rules of etiquette or propriety. And the novel often involves somebody navigating between those forces and their own desires in various ways. And often the outside forces, as you say, are often other women, mothers, sisters, friends, who are pressuring in different ways. So definitely women are, even as they're often thought of making their choices based on, you know, 18th century language would be whim and fancy. Today, it might just be, you know, sort of thoughtlessness or something like that. Social pressures come from every direction, and that's true, I think, in every culture. And the choice architects can be women as well. But in the case of something like voting, what's interesting that happens is women, suffrage movement, women often say, why can't we have choice in this realm? We already have it in all these other realms. And the anti-suffrage people come back and say, no, you can't make serious decisions. You can only decide about ribbons or something like that, not about serious things. But on the other hand, it's precisely the organization of a choice architecture around the secret ballot, the kind of structures that are put in place largely by men that make voting also eventually safe for women to perform. It's not a free-for-all in public. It becomes a kind of carefully orchestrated decision with a set ballot and, you know, kind of rules of the game. So, I mean, I try to sort of show the ways in which liberation and constraint, as you very nicely put it, are kind of always happening at the same time. And women find themselves on both sides of that process. But it's a very important point that women often do play, even today, the role of kind of, if sometimes the formal rules, but more often the informal rules. You know, what's okay, what's propriety.
Right, right. And I just had one last question, which was, to what extent, you know, because this question of how choice, toward the end of the book, where you say that it's pretty weak tea to a certain extent, when you want to talk about issues of justice or egalitarianism or freedom, that choice, there's something about it. I mean, it does, the term itself, you know, has become pretty divorced from Hercules's choice.
Yes,
The sort of moral dimension of it has been drained, and it's there's something technocratic almost about the vocabulary, maybe. And so, you know, I was wondering, though, the extent to which it's that very weakness that was also its strength for a while, that it was the kind of thing that could bring, you know, people from very different communities with very different personal experiences, very different backgrounds, to say, oh yeah, I want choice. We can agree that, you know, people like it.
I think that's absolutely right, that it's both weak tea and it gathers people. So the best example I think of this is 1973. Roe v. Wade has just been decided, and all these organizations like NOW realized that they better find some way to kind of make abortion palatable to the public. And you can read the minutes of things like Now and Planned Parenthood, all these organizations, and they try a lot of things like, population control. No, sounds scary. Equality for women, problematic. Healthcare. The English go that way, right? No, not a good idea. These are all different sort of framing devices. Choice. They say this could be consensual. No one is opposed to choice. You don't have to like abortion. You don't have to have an abortion. You're just saying everyone can pick what suits their own needs, lifestyle, tastes. And there's a real sense that this might be a really winning strategy. It's almost like an advertising strategy. Well, pretty quickly, the counter is not a right to choice, but a right to life. And it's a clever strategy because life sounds a lot more weighty in some ways than choice. That's the counter on the right, which is to say, this shouldn't be a choice. Something more important is at stake. There's also a left response almost immediately, a kind of farther left response, especially Black feminists and more radical women's groups who say, choice. But what does that mean if you can't afford to get one and you can't get there and you don't have the day off from work if you need to, and there aren't any providers in your area and no one's going to help you raise the child, etc. What's choice? That sounds like, it's not really a real menu option. And so there were these kind of two challenges almost immediately. And I think we're sort of seeing in the last few years some of the weaknesses of the choice framing, that it never really, though choice sounds like a very now modern American democratic, even human rights position, it hasn't galvanized people because the choices become what's moral rather than a debate about what would really allow people to flourish. How would we be a healthier, happier, better off community? Somehow that's sort of been given up in the discussion that what's most important is just keeping that option on the menu. So I think that's sort of where you see its potential to, it was supposed to cross all boundaries. It was supposed to appeal across the political spectrum, but obviously it didn't quite work. So that would be sort of my example for that.
May I jump in with one?
Please.
If you,
Yeah,
Please.
about this, I wonder what's the status of collective choice? Because
Yeah.
choice in the book is exclusively individual.
Right.
And if you take even, at the end of the book, the Roe Wade, my body, my choice, of course, it's an individual right.
Yeah.
Okay. It's an individual body. But that right has been secured through feminist movement. That is a collective determination of an agenda,
Right.
which is a very different sort of choice, right? It's if we all vote in this room, it's an aggregation of individual choices.
Right.
But if we start talking to each other, then I may discover preferences I didn't know I have, or I might actually change my mind. You might sway me. This is a far cry from set theory, right? It's just
Right.
the opposite. That has nothing to do with rational choice. But so what's the status of that?
Right.
In a way, the choice, the expansion of choice, the expansion of freedom as an end result is always the end result of something that is fundamentally collective. We secured my body, my choice as women. You secure choice as workers, as union members, as faculty, as students. So there's an element of which we think better with others. And the parliament example of the Republicans who were afraid to vote, it's not just transparency on the vote, it's also the parliament as a function of, I don't want to use a Habermasian expression, but will formation. It's about debating and figuring out what the choices should be, rather than entering with the choices already made. So I was wondering about the status of collective choice in this story.
Right. And this is what Mill, for instance, was so worried about losing. He thought, how can you make a good political decision if it isn't subject to a collective sense of what's in our shared good? And how can we make it without a kind of deliberative process in which I hear from somebody who's standing in a different place than me, and I'm able to assimilate that into, and he really worried that an individualized but aggregated kind of decision-making was a real failure of democracy. Although it's, obviously he's been on the losing side of that argument, since aggregation is how voting now takes place everywhere. I think in all sorts of arenas, we do use collective choice. I think you're absolutely right, but we don't talk about it as meaning choice. And I really did decide to concentrate more on this story of how we got to the sort of atomized choice maker, even when it came to group decisions. But in practice, of course, small groups, meetings of civil society groups, I don't know, department meetings. I mean, all kinds of things can happen in ways that are sometimes more collective. Family decisions. I talk about a wonderful South Asian novel that's really about what happens when the family as a unit gets pulled apart by modern commerce and everybody has to decide what's in their own interest, and it destroys the family entirely, which had been a kind of single unit. So it's not that collective choice has gone away, but when we talk about valuing choice and freedom, what we tend to mean, whether it's a decision about politics or it's a decision about incandescent light bulbs, is a kind of individualized version, I think. And maybe the point is we need to have more conversations about what collective choice should look like and when we might employ it, and would it work? It might be an interesting place to go.
Okay, let's open it up a little bit. I have three more. Okay, slow down. So as I have many hands up by this point, can you please keep your questions under a minute and ending in a question mark rather than a long paragraph of a comment? So Stephen, please introduce yourselves in 2 words as well, so that everyone knows who should be addressing. So Stephen, Atusa, Daniel, and
I enjoyed the conversation. My name is Steve Milder. I'm a fellow here this semester at Remarque. And I was wondering just about kind of the how this conversation develops into the present, especially you mentioned Trump's how important Trump finds it to give people choices about light bulbs. And on the other hand, and you also talked about like the dwindling of choice as a moral, the Hercules' choice having gone away. And it seems like on the other end of that environmental conversation, there are a lot of people who are saying like exactly what you choose, whether you choose to fly or to, ride your bike to get where you want to go, or whether you choose to eat meat or a plant-based diet is actually like an incredibly, there is a right and a wrong choice. And so I was wondering kind of like whether, particularly in the moment of environmental conversations on climate crisis that we're in now, if that reflects in any way on the development of choice.
Thank you for that question. Very briefly, I'll say 2 things. There are still choices that we remoralize. I think boycotts often take the form not of what do I like, but what's the right thing to do. Boycotting Tesla, for instance, is not about you like the color of the car. So there are places in which we use that choice sometimes to return to a version of Hercules' choice. Your examples about, say, do I fly or do I drive might be, or do I take public transportation might be an example there. On the other hand, I think we're also quite aware that a lot of personal decisions like do I recycle clothes are really not going to solve global warming, and that a lot of little tiny decisions, they're nice and they make you feel like you're on the right side of things. But until we have some collective, back to this idea of a kind of sense of the collective good, that a lot of decisions individually about appliances that you buy or something is going to be a kind of weak tea, I guess you could say, for solving something that transcends all kinds of boundaries and things. So I'm not disparaging those kinds of choices, but I'm not sure that they're sufficient for kind of crises we probably are in.
Hi, I'm Atusa Ibrahimian, a fellow here and a journalist. And I was wondering what you make of the fact that there is a consultant for everything now. If you have enough money, you can hire someone to tell you where to send your kids to school, what to eat for dinner, what nail polish to wear. I mean, this is just across the board. And in a corporate sense, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. And I was wondering if you sort of conceptualize this as almost a desire to live like a medieval lord, or if it's something else, because there is kind of too much choice if you're in a certain social class.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think about this all the time now. There's a consultant for everything, right? And if you can't afford a consultant, algorithms sometimes play that role for you. For Netflix or something like that. Which movie would you like? Right. People help us, financial advisors, stylists, all kinds of people. And what they're doing is helping us navigate a world in which choice has become overwhelming. In almost any category, there's somebody who could help you out. If school were simply, I live here, there's my school, you wouldn't have school consultants, right? If you say, oh, it's New York City, huh? How do I play this game? You know, then you have a school consultant. I think that's a very big part of the story, is the rise of advisors of all kinds to help us. They're not usually the same people who sometimes with the algorithms, they sometimes are the same. Choice architects are also the people who help you then navigate. Sometimes there are two different kinds of sets of professions, the people who create the rules of the game and the people who then help you kind of be your personal shopper or something like that.
Oh, and,
Thanks. I'm Daniel. I'm a PhD student at Yale. Sophia, I wanted to ask you a question about the kind of historiographical move that you make at the end of the book, where you say in the epilogue that in historicizing choice, one thing that we do is, well, we do two things. We open up the possibility of conceiving of what it means to be free, what we want to be as subjects in our present social world differently. But we also trouble the notion that to do history is, as you write, to show the particularity and contingency of choices that people make in the past, right? We suggest that maybe there's something universalizing about the logic of choice that we're reading back historically onto everyone, such that all historical subjects become liberal subjects. And I wonder if I could ask you to kind of reflect on what it would mean to write history outside of that framework, right? If this is troubling not only our conception of choice for ourselves in the present, but how we that back historically, what would it mean to write histories that don't aim to show the contingency of choices that people
Right. It's a very good question. Unfortunately, I don't have to actually write that history. I could just suggest how it would be done. So for people in the room who aren't familiar with this, there's been a move in history writing in the last years towards giving even people who've had some of the most constrained circumstances imaginable, say the enslaved, by giving them more agency than we might have thought that they had. And as a way of showing, in a sense, giving them dignity, that even in the worst circumstances, people find ways to make choices for themselves, even with the worst options, even in the most constrained moments. And it's a way of saying these people weren't lesser, they're just navigating through an incredibly, in circumstances that are hard to imagine. And there's some great value to that, and it's produced some wonderful work. But there is a risk too, which is to imagine that all people in all times and places have imagined themselves like us doing this thing where we say, would I prefer X or Y? Is it, do I like this or do I like that? And sometimes that seems to me in the most, there's an example even book I read about the Aztecs, human sacrifice, and there's sort of a rational choice explanation for like why you might participate in the ritual of cutting somebody up and burning them alive, that kind of thing. So in other words, an inability to imagine that people might have been doing this for reasons that are alien to us, but have little to do with thinking, am I better off protesting or participating, that kind of thing. So I don't have a recipe exactly, but I think the whole book is written very unprescriptively. I'm not telling anybody what I think because I don't think I have a good answer. Which choices should we make? Which should we not? Who should be written about this way? Who shouldn't be? But I hope that it would make people more self-conscious, historians about their subjects and all the rest of us about even in daily life. Why am I choosing to choose in these moments? Am I imagining everybody as having all sorts of opportunities to choose? There is a way in which we punish people in this society, often those with the fewest choices, by imagining them as having, you chose to deal drugs or something like that, as if everybody just had an array of possibilities. and they pick the bad one. Well, I mean, we don't all have the same choices in front of us, and we don't even all think about choice the same way. So I think if there's anything, it's a sort of grace towards others, imagining their circumstance, and maybe a self-consciousness about ourselves that is really the message, which sounds, you know, a little namby-pamby maybe, but I don't want to be prescriptive. Just really a kind of, it's hard to sometimes step out of our liberal framework and see ourselves from a distance because what we do is so obvious. But I think all of my work is about an effort to sort of denaturalize the things that we do rather habitually or instinctively otherwise.
Do you want to take questions too? Would that be okay? And then Kate.
So Flora Champi, I'm a professor of French. Hi. Professor of French at Princeton. I try to refrain from seeing Rousseau everywhere. When we were mentioning the secret ballot, he actually has very good remarks in book 4, chapter 4, explaining how the secret ballot is a good way to preserve a sense of interest when private individuals have become too vulnerable to private. My real question was on behavioral economics. You said that you used it in writing the book. To me, behavioral economics sounds very much like a pseudoscience that often takes, you know, their wishes for as an assumption, but maybe there's a productive use of them. And I was curious how you used them. Was it helpful for you to frame your view of choice? Or maybe your writing of history may help contextualize and nuance some behavioral economics?
I thought this was great. It was very exciting. I have 2 questions that came up. One is, I'm wondering about the kind of class character of choice and how you're understanding that, especially given what you've already emphasized about the limitations of choice for oftentimes lower income people and also upper income people. There's actually a desire to have choice constraints. So I'm wondering in what ways this kind of emphasis on choice is also about an evolution of the social spectrum to in increasing the middle class. The second thing is about the kinds of constraints and different domains as you've laid them out, and the sort of form of justification. So given that shoppers and voters and other people know that they are constrained, are there ways that choice is just, or the constraints on choice are legitimated differently across different domains, and if they are, which I guess what does that do to our understanding of what choice is within our context?
All right, I will very quickly. Laura's interesting question of behavioral choice. I wanted to both draw on it and offer a corrective. Draw on it in the sense that I don't think when behavioral economists have discovered that we're not very good choice makers, frankly, I think novelists got there a long time ago. And, what their discovery that we're not rational all the time and we change our mind. Read any fiction, read mythology for that matter. I mean, it's sort of, that seems like not a very deep insight, though they empirically demonstrate it in ways that are harder for most of us to do. But I did find the emphasis on this term again of the choice architect to be quite interesting. The fact, and behavioral economists have sort of shown quite effectively, not that we're responsive to all kinds of things, duh, in a sense, right? But that there are specific people playing this role in almost every scenario. They're always interested in things like, do you put the apples near the cash register or the chocolate bar? Because actually, we're such sheep that we'll be more likely to buy the apple if it's sitting in the right place, and the other way around, we buy the chocolate bar. Okay, that's important to know. It's a nudge, as they call it. But that said, we're always being nudged, and these aren't the only times we're being nudged. So I found that useful. So I did adopt some of the language of behavioral economics. Where I differ is that they take generally as natural that we are choosers and this is how we're going to operate. And what I hope to do is sort of do something that I don't think even the political theorists who write about these kinds of questions do, which is say, oh, stop for a moment. Not everyone everywhere in the world, even today, a lot of the pushback against American ways of life is precisely aimed at places that, at people who are rejecting this whole paradigm. So I want to sort of suggest that there's a deeper level here of thinking about why we're categorizing people this way to begin with, not just this question of who gives the nudges to whom. On the class character, I'll probably answer that rather than the other one for the sake of time. To a certain degree, the wealthy have always had greater choices, even as they've mattered less to the wealthy. So for instance, people could pick different kinds of silks very early on in any place where silk was exported to. One of the interesting things that happens when calico, which is a product, of course, of the fact that already much of Western Europe is embedded in imperial structures as early the 17th century when calico starts to arrive in Western Europe, is that it's available at a new price point. And it's cheap fabric that takes on a lot of different fabrics, different patterns. And it allows ordinary people, one of the first occasions in which you didn't just buy the cloth that you could afford or that fit your social strata or that sumptuary laws determine, but, and that's why display comes about in the same moment, offering ordinary people the chance to make those kinds of selections is something of a new opportunity. So I try to look at those moments where choice gets kind of mainstreamed. Now, do middle-class people get there first? Yes, they do a lot of the time. But by the time we're talking about, back to the voting in the 19th century, we're really talking about a mass public in many of these places. And of course, this is stratified. The options are different for different people. There are racial divisions. There are all kinds of the ordinary divisions you'd expect. But it's the massification of choice in this individualized model that interests me. And also its export around the world. You know, dancing manuals, for instance, by the mid-19th century, they're mainly aimed at elites, but they're available everywhere from Santiago to St. Petersburg, Chicago, Stockholm. You know, they have a pretty wide arena. And by the 20th century, obviously, we can find elements of a kind of commercialized focus on choice almost anywhere where there either is a pretext of democracy or a capitalist market.
Yeah, I have two questions. How much of a role does brand loyalty play in the process of choice making? And when we were taking it back to the question of secret ballots versus public ballots, brand loyalty or party loyalty or whatever your loyalty or affiliation is, must play a disproportionate role in choice making. In a way, brand loyalty is to not make a choice because you made a prior set of choices. The other question is about informed choices. An informed choice would seem to be the ideal choice to make, but we're now in an era where the ability to make an informed choice, I mean, increasingly problematic.
So I had a question for Hope, so I had to introduce myself. My name's Chaya, I'm a college, but I would be really interested in, because you're a historian and you trace the radical emphasis of choice. There's this old Jewish joke. That's one thing that got lax, and it's radical emphasis on choice is actually, you know what I mean, the very thing that is also, rally against limitation, because I mean, a large part of the now, how in fact that you cannot limit choice no matter what you do, because you've always been burdened by what has been. And that's, verbatim, and no one's really gonna debate that. So do you think that's more reflective of the arrogance of modernity?
That's a hard question. I mean, I think people always deceive themselves in any circumstance, right? That a lot of things people do are illusory in various ways. It's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer whether we're sort of more likely to deceive ourselves in this moment. But your question in some ways dovetails with the earlier one about informed choice, which is one of the great conversations of this moment. Have we become so inundated with poor information that in fact, it's not just that we ignore good information, it's that we're inundated with bad information. We can't differentiate anymore Facebook feeds to television, what's true, what's not true. It comes from above, it comes from below. And this does test for sure this idea that autonomous idea, right? That good choices are made with full information in certain ways. So, I mean, I think that's where the question going forward. The brand loyalty question comes back to the question also about advisors of various kinds. We want to limit our choices because we can't deal with them. So if you go to the supermarket and you're looking at the cereal aisle, most of us are going to pick the same cereal we got last time. Because who wants to try another box with some new improved flavor or something like that? Same with most things. We go with brands because it's easier. They tell us what we want. And brands are a sort of an advisor to us. They don't really exist until first part of the 20th century. Stores, supermarkets start to have kind of branding as an element of what they do. And it's considered a great innovation, but it's also hard to get people off of them and to try new things because people are like habits of various kinds. So I mean, all of these questions suggest exactly what I think I'm trying to do, which is make us think in various ways about how we make all of these different decisions. What are the sort of factors that shape from brands to information to attitudes about modernity? What are the things that impinge upon how we select from the most tiny things like the Starbucks takeout to the biggest things like, what do you want to do with your life? I will say one final thing about this. There's one realm though that's really different from all of this. That is the world of work. I didn't say this earlier, but work is not organized around choice. Do not go to the workplace and say, let me think what I'd like to do, what appeals to me here. And I think it's important that all of this other stuff has happened in the sphere that we call free time, which is including vote. And all the things that we do apart from the workplace have increasingly taken this kind of form of individualized choice, even when it's sometimes group-based. But this has happened in tandem with the work world for most people, not every, except for say the gig economy and freelance. Most people work in structured workplaces where there's a chain of command. Some people decide for other people, and individual needs and desires are not the paramount thing at all. And I don't think that's coincidental. I think that's part of the larger story. You want to follow up?
Yeah. Does that mean that work is on a continuum with prison?
I mean, if you were kind of a Foucauldian thinker, schools, prisons, I don't think that there are spaces of total freedom, and there are probably not that many spaces of total constraint. Everything's on a kind of continuum, but there's a basic differential structure to places like schools, especially K-12 schools, and workplaces, possibly prisons, military, that are structured on principles that are quite apart. They're all sort of quasi-workplaces that are structured quite apart from this sort of more free-form notion of the free-floating chooser that's in all these other sectors. Tinder to the supermarket, basically.
Well, this hardly closes our discussion, but why don't we just continue it outside? Please join me in thanking Sophie and Nicolas.
Thanks,